Grammar rule number 11, run-ons and comma splices. This is page 81 of the writing manual. Run-ons and comma splices. We are going to go over a little bit of terminology before we jump into these rules, just so everybody is clear what the heck we're talking about. I'm going to actually add one term here before the ones actually listed, and that is a phrase. I'm going to go ahead and write down group of words lacking a subject and or verb. So a phrase is a group of words lacking a subject and or a verb. I'm going to move over here. If you want to write these examples down somewhere in your manual, you can, or on a separate piece of paper, you can. If you want to just follow along with the video, that's perfectly fine too. We have seen some examples of phrases earlier in previous rules. We saw prepositional phrases in subject-verb agreement. Prepositional phrase, something like in the library. Remember that all a prepositional phrase is composed of is an in, which is, well, in this case, an in. That's a preposition. And then the noun that comes after the preposition, so that's the prep. This is the object of the prep. So nowhere in this phrase do we have a subject, and nowhere do we have a verb. So that is a prepositional phrase, one type of phrase, a group of words that lacks a subject or a verb. We also have a positive phrases, which we also saw in subject-verb agreement. Let me get rid of that. Positive phrases, and this would be something like John, a member of the most successful team in history, comma, dot, dot, dot. So what we have between this first comma and this second comma, this is all a big phrase that revolves around this noun, a member. The rest of this stuff that comes after a member is just description for that word member. And so what we have here is we just have a noun followed by a bunch of prepositional phrases. This is what in effect is a noun phrase. A positive, I'll write underneath that noun phrase, because again, we do not have a subject or a verb inside that phrase. We are talking about a phrase and not a clause. We also have a bunch of other types of phrases. There are many types of phrases in the English language. I'm just going to give you those two examples for now so that you understand once again that a phrase is simply a group of words without a subject or a verb. Which brings us to a clause, which is a group of words that does have a subject or subject and a verb. A group of words with both subject and verb. We'll take a look at a couple of examples in a second, but let's move into the two types of clauses. So one type of clause, independent clause, is going to be a clause that can stand on its own. It's a complete sentence, a complete thought, and I'm going to write down all of those things. Complete sentence / thought can stand on its own, versus a dependent clause, which is an incomplete thought, cannot stand on its own. Now keep in mind, just because one of these is complete and one of them is incomplete, remember they are both clauses. They both have subjects and verbs. I'll take you down here to example 1. Look at example 1. This sentence is a work of art. So we have, I'm going to underline the verb twice, and I will underline the subject in blue. And I'll do it for this one as well. So notice in example 1, we have a complete thought. I can come up to someone on the street and say, this sentence is a work of art, and I will have delivered a complete thought. That person might think I am completely nuts for saying such a strange sentence, but that is a complete thought. I have a subject, I have a verb, and I have a complete thought. So this is an independent clause. Now, in example 2, I have while this group of words is certainly nice. Now, I did put a period at the end of this group of words. Unfortunately, though, that is incorrect because periods mean I have just completed a thought or completed a sentence, and this group of words does not complete a thought or make a complete sentence, and it is because of this while. This while makes this second example a dependent clause. I do have a subject and I do have a verb, but this while means I have to complete this thought after the word nice. I have to say something like, while this group of words is certainly nice, and then tack on an independent clause such as, it is not a complete thought. In other words, I can't create a sentence until I have an independent clause somewhere in that sentence. So once again, example 1, that's an independent clause. It's a full sentence, it completes a thought, has a subject and a verb. Example 2 has the subject and the verb, so it is a clause, but it does not complete a thought, so it is a dependent clause. It is not independent, it cannot stand on its own. And now we need to discuss, I don't know what word that is. Now we need to discuss the rules. But first, of course, we have to go over the tip-off clue for this particular rule, and the tip-off clue is two independent clauses in the same sentence. Two independent clauses in the same sentence. So this will require that you be able to recognize an independent clause and then be able to recognize when you have two independent clauses in the same sentence. And the rule is the clauses must be joined appropriately. There are really, on this test, only two ways to join independent clauses, and I'm going to give you those two ways right here in the rule on this second line. We could have one independent clause, and then a comma, and then a fanboys conjunction, and then the other independent clause, and then a period. So one way, again, to join independent clauses is with a comma and a fanboys. The other acceptable way to join independent clauses is with a semicolon. Now, a lot of students do make the point, I'm going to go ahead and highlight that semicolon. A lot of students do make the point that you can also put a period between independent clauses, and that is correct, but on this test, you don't really have to worry about that particular joining of independent clauses, because in the answer choices on sentence corrections, which are these kinds of questions here, the test will never put a period between two independent clauses. In other words, they will never make two sentences out of the single sentence that they give you. So the independent and then the period and then the independent, that will never show up on this test except in your essay, perhaps. So the mistakes, the errors that can be created on these questions. What are the errors that can be created? The errors that can be created are, and I'm going to go ahead and write down possible errors. And the possible errors are the name of this rule, run-ons and comma splices. So we could have a run-on error, and a run-on is when we are missing the comma. In other words, we are missing the comma. In other words, we have independent and then a fanboys and then an independent. That is not correct. We cannot put only a fanboys conjunction. By the way, the fanboys, you should know if you have done the conjunctions rule, but the fanboys are, if you want to list them here, for, and, nor, but, or, yet, and so. For and nor, but, or, yet, so. Those are the fanboys conjunctions. So if we only have a fanboys between two independent clauses, we have what is known as a run-on. We need that comma, we need that punctuation there. And then the other, and actually much more common error that shows up is a comma splice. And that is when we are missing the fanboys. In other words, we have only the comma between two independent clauses. This, like I said, is very common on the SAT, shows up frequently on the sentence corrections, that type of question I just showed you down here. We very frequently see comma splices on those questions. So in examples 3 and 4, you can go ahead and do them on your own right now. Press pause on the video and then come back and join us. So in example 3, what we've got here is we have one independent clause. So basically what you want to do here, actually, what you want to do is anytime you see that comma, you might even want to add that to the tip-off clue. Commas, you might want to add commas, fanboys also. If you see a comma in a sentence, one of the things you want to do is determine what comes before and what comes after. So here's our comma. Before that comma, we have an independent clause. The two wires are placed too closely to each other. That's a complete thought. It's an independent clause. After the comma, we have another independent clause. You might hear interference in your speakers. That is a complete thought, has a subject, has a verb. We have a complete thought. That's an independent clause. So we have two independent clauses here separated by only a comma. That is not correct. We cannot put only a comma between two independent clauses. Remember we said that is a comma splice. This is a comma splice. I'm going to write CS there. The way that we can fix this is by changing that comma to a semicolon. That's one way. The other way is we can add a fanboys. We can do something like comma and then so. The sentence would be the two wires are placed too closely to each other, comma, so you might hear interference in your speakers. Again, we either need the comma and the conjunction, like we have there, or we need the semicolon. But those are the only ways that we can separate these two independent clauses. Next, in example 4, we have he has two computers on his desk, but neither of them functions properly. So again, here's sort of our one of our tip-off clues. We've got a fanboys conjunction. What we've got to do is look before it and after it and think about what we've got. Before it, we have an independent clause. He has two computers on his desk. That is a complete thought. After the but, we have another independent clause. Neither of them functions properly. Another independent clause, another complete thought. We cannot put a fanboys alone between two independent clauses because that is the run-on error that we just discussed. So what we would need to do here, very simply, we can just add a comma. And now we have our comma and our conjunction, and that is one of the acceptable ways to separate two independent clauses. So again, make sure that you are very comfortable and confident spotting comma splice errors because they will show up very frequently on the test. Now the comma splice fixes, the reason we're only talking about comma splice fixes is because again, comma splice is the more common error on the test. So comma splice fixes, there's a few ways to fix comma splices. We've already talked about a couple of them. One is, since remember we're missing the fanboys in a comma splice. Comma splice is independent, comma independent once again. So we're missing the fanboys here. So one of the things that we can do is we can actually insert a fanboys after the comma. In example 1, we have an independent clause here. My sister and I researched many universities. We have an independent clause here. We could not find a single one we both liked. We have two independent clauses separated by only a comma. That is a comma splice. We are not allowed to separate two independent clauses with only a comma. So what we're going to do is we're going to insert a fanboys. My sister and I researched many universities, but we could not find a single one we both liked. In example 2, we can change the comma to a semicolon. Again, we have a comma splice here because we have one independent clause, another independent clause, and we have a comma between the two. We're not allowed to do that. In this case, all I'm going to do is I'm going to change that comma to a semicolon. So these are the two changes that we really just saw on the previous page in these examples here, examples 3 and 4. The most common change, however, that ETS will use is this. You cannot separate two independent clauses with only a comma. You cannot do, again, you cannot do independent, comma, independent. However, it is perfectly acceptable to do this, to do this, to do this, or to do this. In other words, it is perfectly acceptable to put only a comma between an independent clause and something that is not an independent clause. In other words, between an independent clause and a dependent, an independent clause and a phrase, and you can do it in any order. You can put the independent first, then the comma, then the dependent. You can put the dependent first, then the comma, then the independent. That is perfectly acceptable. So in examples 3 and 4, you should try these on your own. They're a little bit tricky sometimes to figure out what change we are looking for here, but go ahead and do 3 and 4 on your own. See if you can figure out how to create one of these 4 scenarios in these 2 examples. Press pause on the video and then come back and join us. Okay, so in example 3, we have this comma here. That should be one of the things that tells us we need to look for a comma splice. And indeed, in this sentence, we do have a comma splice because we have an independent clause before the comma and an independent clause after the comma. We are not allowed to have that. That is our good old, or good bad, or bad old, or whatever you want to say, comma splice. So we need to figure out how to change this sentence so it's not a comma splice. Now, obviously, one of the things we could do is we could change the comma to a semicolon. We could add a fanboys. But remember, what we're trying to do in these fixes is the more common fix that ETS will use. We're trying to make one of the 2 independent clauses dependent or into a phrase. And the way that we can do that in this sentence is we can insert an of which before the are here. If we say many of which are found nowhere else on the planet, we actually make this second half of the sentence not independent anymore. Many of which are found nowhere else is not an independent thought. It is not a complete thought or a sentence. It actually creates a phrase. So we would now have independent and then the comma and then a phrase. That phrase does include a dependent clause within it, but either way, whether the second half is a phrase or a dependent clause, we are fine. We are allowed to separate independent from dependent or phrase with just a comma. So we are perfectly fine now with inserting this of which. In example 4, we have our modern solar calendar is based on the Julian calendar, comma, Julius Caesar introduced it in 45 BC. Once again, we have a comma splice. This is an independent clause. This is an independent clause. That is not allowed. We cannot have only a comma between 2 independent clauses. Probably the most efficient change here would be to change this second independent clause to introduced by Julius Caesar in 45 BC. Now what we have done, once again, is we have an independent, comma, and then we just have a descriptive phrase. We just have an adjective or participial phrase, I think that would be called. We have a phrase after the comma, and that is perfectly acceptable. We can do independent, comma, phrase. So those are the the comma splice fixes. We can insert a fanboys like we did here. We can change the comma to a semicolon, and then probably the most common and sometimes most elegant way to fix a comma splice is to create one of these 4 scenarios: independent, comma, dependent, and so on. Proper semicolon usage. ETS will test proper semicolon usage. The rule is a semicolon can only come between 2 independent clauses. In other words, it is not correct to do independent, semicolon, dependent. That is not allowed. You cannot do independent semicolon phrase. That is not allowed. The only thing you are allowed to do with semicolons is independent, semicolon, independent. Semicolons have to come between two independent clauses. Now, in example 5, if you want to do it on your own, pause the video and come back and join us. In example 5, we have I searched for my keys in every corner of my house, finally locating them in my pocket, and we have a semicolon between those two parts of the sentence. Well, before the semicolon, we're okay because we have an independent clause, but after the semicolon, we don't have an independent clause at all. In fact, we don't have a clause at all. This is just a phrase. So we're not allowed to do that. The two ways that we could fix this, I'll go ahead and write them down here. We could keep the independent clause, and then we could actually change the semicolon to a comma, and then we could keep this finally locating phrase. That would be perfectly fine. So in other words, one of the things we can do is we can change the semicolon into a comma, and then the other fix is to keep the first independent clause the same, keep the semicolon there, and then change the second half of the sentence to I finally located, and now we have a main verb here. I finally located them in my pocket. So again, we have to make sure semicolons come between two independent clauses, not between an independent clause and a dependent, or an independent clause and a phrase. Now keep in mind one other note is that on the SAT, the colon is used almost identically to the semicolon. In other words, in the same way that we can only put a semicolon between two independent clauses, we only want to put colons between two independent clauses. If you see independent, colon, independent, that's probably perfectly fine. A lot of students have been taught that colons only introduce lists of items, and that is true, that that's one of the uses of a colon, but a colon can also come between two independent clauses. It's not really that important that you understand when you would use a colon and when you would use a semicolon. Just know that they pretty much can be used interchangeably on this test. Okay, now punctuation and conjunctive adverbs. Every now and then on this test, what you might see is a word such as however, or therefore, or nevertheless. Those words are known as conjunctive adverbs, and basically if you see, so here, let's go ahead and write down these tip-off clues first. I'm just going to list the conjunctive adverbs. However, therefore, consequently, nevertheless, then, ... So those are some of the conjunctive adverbs, and not all of them, but there's some of them, and they're the more common ones you'll see on this test. So if you see any of those conjunctive adverbs between two independent clauses, conjunctive adverb between two independent clauses, the rule is this, and I'm just going to write down the pattern. One independent clause, we're going to need that followed by a semicolon. Right after the semicolon will come our conjunctive adverb. Then we will need our other punctuation mark, the comma, and then we will need our second independent clause. That is the pattern that you need to follow if you see a conjunctive adverb between two independent clauses. The first independent, the semicolon, the conjunctive adverb, the comma, and then the second independent clause. Now keep in mind, you don't always have to have this pattern when you see a conjunctive adverb, because you could have a sentence like, I did not, comma, however, comma, eat the pork brains. I did not, however, eat the pork brains. Notice that we just have 2 commas around this conjunctive adverb. That obviously doesn't follow the pattern that we just talked about. But that is fine because this, however, is not coming between 2 independent clauses. Instead, it is just nestled in the middle of one independent clause. So the only time where you need this pattern, semicolon, conjunctive adverb, comma, is when you are bookended, when those things are bookended by independent clauses. Example 6, go ahead and do it on your own, then come back and join us. In example 6, we have, our flight was scheduled to depart an hour ago. However, weather conditions have brought the entire airport to a standstill. So again, we should spot that we have a conjunctive adverb here. We should check to see if we have an independent clause before, and indeed we do. We should check to see if we have an independent clause after, and indeed we do. What we need is the pattern that we just discussed. We need, since this is our conjunctive adverb, this, however, we need the proper punctuation before, and that's a semicolon, and the proper punctuation after, and that's a comma. And now we have this sentence properly punctuated. In this little table, this little chart here, these are all of the ways that we can join clauses and phrases, independent clauses, dependent clauses, phrases. You should know this chart. You should basically just have it memorized. Remember that this is probably our most common error that occurs on the test. When we have independent, comma, independent, that is a comma splice. This was the issue I had discussed a moment ago about putting independent, then a colon, then an independent, pretty much exactly the same as the semicolon. Again, you should be very familiar with these arrangements and know what is allowed and not allowed. Down at the bottom, number 7, go ahead and do it on your own, then come back and join us. Okay, so in number 7 we had never seen anything like this style of architecture before. We thought we were looking at the giant sculptures, not buildings. So we actually have 2 commas in this sentence, so we've got to keep an eye on those. 1 comma there, 1 comma there. Let's take a look at this first comma. And remember, we said when we see a comma, we have to check what comes before and what comes after. And indeed, in this sentence, before that comma, we have an independent clause. We had never seen anything like this style of architecture before. And then after the comma, we have another independent clause. We thought we were looking at giant sculptures. Those are both complete statements, and we have a comma between them. That is not allowed. We are not allowed to put a comma between 2 independent clauses. Now, normally we would want to go ahead and make our own change. We would want to try to change this underlined portion on our own before going to the answers. In this case, I am just going to go right to the answers. I'm going to eliminate A because I know that's an exact replica of what is already underlined, and we know that what is already underlined does create a problem, so we're going to get rid of answer choice A. Answer choice B, notice that it maintains the independent clause before the comma. We never saw anything like this before. That's still an independent clause, so we have not fixed the comma splice error. We still have independent, comma, independent. Same thing with answer choice C. Never had we seen anything like this before. That is a complete thought. We cannot put a complete thought before the comma. Still independent, comma, independent. Answer choice D does do what we need it to do in terms of getting rid of the independent clause before the comma. In this case, we have phrase, comma, independent, which we did say is perfectly allowed. We can have a phrase and an independent clause separated by a comma, and this does keep the correct tense of the original sentence. Never having seen anything like this style of architecture before, comma, we thought. Basically, what's going on here is the thought is happening in the simple past, and the never having seen indicates that something happened, or the never seeing happened before the past. That's what that phrase, never having seen, means. It means that at some point before this simple past action, the thought, we had never seen the style of architecture before. So this answer choice corrects the comma splice and does a good job of maintaining the appropriate tense. And then answer E unfortunately changes the tense, never seeing anything like this style of architecture before. That seeing is a present participle, and again, we wanted something that indicated before the past, which is what answer choice D does. So E corrects the comma splice error. Unfortunately, it changes the tense in a way that is no longer appropriate, and we have our answer. That is it for comma splices and run-ons. Again, just to recap, make sure you know what these phrases, what this terminology means. Make sure you understand that when you have two independent clauses in the same sentence, you only have two acceptable ways of separating those independent clauses from each other, comma and fanboys or semicolon. If you are missing either the comma or the fanboys, you have either a run-on or a comma splice error. There are several ways to fix comma splices. This third fix is probably the most important. Remember that semicolons can only come between two independent clauses, and make sure you know the appropriate pattern for separating two independent clauses with a conjunctive adverb. Make sure you know the proper punctuation. You also should probably just have memorized all of these scenarios, what is allowed, what is not allowed. That will most likely make you a little more confident and help you go a little bit more quickly. That is all for run-ons and comma splices.